The maid gathered courage and interrupted the millionaire's forced marriage. The reflection in the bathroom mirror of the luxurious St. Patrick's Cathedral didn't lie. Lucy Anderson was about to commit the biggest folly of her life. Her hands were shaking as she adjusted the modest navy blue dress she had chosen for the day, a stark contrast to the elaborate outfits of the guests at Manhattan's most anticipated wedding. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. 3 years of repressed feelings were about to explode, and there was no turning back. A few meters away, Christopher Bennett, the man her heart was secretly beating for, was about to say yes to the wrong person. Lucy still vividly remembered the first time she entered the imposing Bennett mansion on the Upper East Side. Fresh from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with nothing but a degree in literature and a lot of dreams, she had landed the position of housekeeper at the Bennett residence, one of the most influential families in New York. Christopher, heir to the Bennett Industries empire, was nothing like the tabloids portrayed him. Behind the facade of the cold and calculating businessman, Lucy discovered a sensitive man who spent late nights in the mansion's library, lost among books of poetry and cups of chamomile tea. It was during these evenings that they developed a unique connection, talking about literature, fears, and dreams. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living the life that others have planned for me," he had confided on one of those evenings, his green eyes fixed on the flames of the fireplace. Lucy could still feel the weight of those words, the way their hands brushed as she poured him more tea. The sound of organs beginning to play the wedding march pulled Lucy out of her memories. Victoria Sinclair, the bride, was about to make her triumphant entrance. Lucy knew the type well. She had witnessed countless telephone conversations in which Victoria made her true intentions clear to Christopher. The wedding was nothing more than a business transaction for her, a way to rise socially and secure access to the Bennett empire. Margaret Bennett, the matriarch of the family and architect of this marriage arrangement, had orchestrated everything perfectly. Lucy watched her manipulate her son, as a conductor conducts his orchestra, using Christopher's sense of family duty as his main baton. Bennett marries for strategic alliances, not for love, was her favorite mantra. Lucy left the bathroom, her wobbly legs carrying her down the side aisle of the cathedral. Through the colored stained glass windows, rays of sunlight created a mosaic on the marble floor. The church was packed, the cream of New York society, politicians, businessmen, all dressed in their finest designer clothes. Christopher stood at the altar, marvelous in his Armani tuxedo, but Lucy could see beyond the perfect facade. She knew his every micro-expression, the slight frown, the way his right hand closed and opened, repeatedly clear signs of his restlessness. Victoria began her walk down the center aisle, a Vera Wang angel, her calculated smile perfectly positioned for the photographs. Lucy felt her heart race. It was now or never. Her hands were sweating as she discreetly positioned herself next to one of the side columns. The priest began the traditional, "If anyone has anything against this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." Lucy felt time stand still. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but something inside her, something greater than fear, pushed her forward. "I object," her voice echoed through the cathedral, surprising even herself with its firmness. The silence that followed was deafening. Hundreds of shocked faces turned in her direction, including Christopher's, whose eyes widened in recognition. "Lucy," he whispered, his name escaping like a prayer from his lips. Victoria was the first to recover from her shock. "Who does that maid think she is?" she hissed, her face contorted in fury. Lucy stepped forward, her hands shaking, but her voice firm. "I'm someone who knows the real Christopher Bennett. Someone who knows that he prefers black coffee on Monday mornings, but mint tea on the other days. Who knows his secret love of romantic poetry and his hidden collection of classic novels." With every word, Lucy moved closer to the altar, her eyes fixed on Christopher. "I'm someone who saw him cry when he lost his childhood dog, who heard him laugh genuinely as he told stories of his teenage years. Someone who knows that his greatest fear is not failing in business, but letting down the people he loves." Christopher's face was a mixture of emotions, surprise, confusion, and something else, something that made Lucy's heart skip a beat. Recognition, perhaps? Or was it hope? Margaret Bennett rose from her seat, her voice sharp as steel. Security remove this person immediately. But before anyone could move, Christopher raised his hand, silencing the chaos that was beginning to form. His eyes never left Lucy's, and for the first time in 3 years she saw something different in them, saw the mask of duty and obligation begin to crack. Their fate hung by a thread, suspended in that moment of courage and truth. Lucy had laid all her cards on the table, exposing her heart for all to see. Now all that remained was to wait and see if Christopher would have the courage to do the same. The silence in St. Patrick's Cathedral was almost palpable. Christopher Bennet stood motionless at the altar, his green eyes fixed on Lucy as if trying to decipher a particularly complex riddle. Victoria Sinclair next to him emanated a restrained fury that made the air vibrate. "Christopher," Margaret Bennet intervened, her voice low but authoritative. "Don't allow this embarrassing situation to continue." She approached her, son touching his arm with fingers that looked like claws disguised in silk gloves. But Christopher didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he stepped forward, coming down the aisle with an expression Lucy had never seen before, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that made her heart soar. "All those nights in the library," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "When you'd come over with tea and we'd talk until dawn, I looked forward to them. I planned to stay up just to have those moments." A murmur of surprise ran through the congregation. Victoria let out an indignant sound, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her perfectly manicured hands. "Mr. Bennet," the priest interjected, clearly uncomfortable, "perhaps we should continue with the ceremony." "No." The word came firmly from Christopher's lips, surprising everyone. "I can't keep pretending that this is what I want." Lucy felt her legs go weak. Could it be that he too? "For 3 years," Christopher continued, now moving closer to Lucy, "I watched how you looked after not just the house but all of us, how you knew exactly when someone needed a kind word or just understanding silence." Margaret Bennet stepped forward, her normally controlled face contorted with anger. "Christopher, think about what you're doing. The Sinclairs are crucial, partners for the company's expansion on the West Coast." "It's always been about business, hasn't it, Mom?" Christopher turned to face her. "Every decision, every choice in my life has been calculated to benefit the company, even who I was supposed to love." Lucy watched the scene unfold, her heart beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Christopher's words seemed unreal, as if he were dreaming. "Remember that night we discussed Pride and Prejudice?" Christopher asked, turning to Lucy. "You said that true love transcends social classes and societal expectations. That night I realized I was in love with you." A collective sigh echoed through the cathedral. Victoria threw her bouquet to the ground with a dramatic gesture. "This is ridiculous, a maid." "An extraordinary woman," Christopher corrected her, without taking his eyes off Lucy. "Someone who knows me better than anyone in this church. Someone who has never tried to change me or use me for her own interests." Lucy took a hesitant step towards him. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "For the same reason you've kept silent for so long," he replied softly. "Fear, duty, everyone's expectations. But when you walked through that door today, Lucy, you gave me courage." Margaret Bennet started walking towards the guests, trying to control the damage. "Clearly, my son is under some kind of emotional stress. The ceremony will be postponed." "It won't be postponed, Mother," Christopher interrupted her. "It will be cancelled. I can't marry Victoria when my heart belongs to someone else." Victoria Sinclair finally exploded. "This is an outrage. My father will withdraw all support for Bennet Industries." "Let him," Christopher replied calmly. "I'd rather rebuild the company from scratch than live a lie." He moved closer to Lucy, now standing only a few steps away. "For 3 years I've treasured your every smile, every little gesture of kindness, every meaningful conversation. I watched you through the library windows as you tended the garden, singing softly to the flowers. I saw how you treated our staff with respect and dignity, something that few in this society do." Lucy felt hot tears run down her cheeks. "I thought I was alone in these feelings." "You never were," he whispered, finally eliminating the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "And if you give me a chance, I promise I'll never let you feel alone again." The chaos in the cathedral reached its peak. Photographers were frantically shooting flashes, Guests were whispering in shock, and the Bennet family seemed on the verge of a collective breakdown. But for Lucy and Christopher, the world had been reduced to that moment, that touch. "What happens now?" Lucy asked, her voice just a whisper. Christopher smiled, that rare, true smile she loved so much. Now we start our own story. No expectations, no external pressures, just the two. Gave us being true to each other. And there, under the century-old stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral, as the scandal of the century unfolded around them, Lucy Anderson and Christopher Bennet finally allowed their hearts to speak louder than their doubts. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and challenges, but for the first time in their lives, they both felt they were exactly where they were meant to be. The chaos that followed the breakdown of the wedding turned the elegant St. Patrick's Cathedral into a social battlefield. While Christopher and Lucy remained united by their gaze and the touch of their intertwined hands, the world around them crumbled in slow motion. Victoria Sinclair, still in her Vera Wang dress, marched towards the exit, followed by her entourage of bridesmaids. Her father, Maxwell Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, rose from his seat, his face red with fury. "Bennet, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. On Monday, all our contracts will be cancelled." Margaret Bennet, demonstrating her ability to keep up appearances, even in the worst situations, began to circulate among the guests. "My dears, please make your way to the Plaza Hotel. Lunch will be served as planned. Consider this a different celebration." Christopher held Lucy tighter as two security guards approached, clearly under orders from his mother. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his voice carrying an authority Lucy had never witnessed before. "We need to get out of here," Lucy whispered, feeling the weight of the stairs and camera flashes. The news was probably already circulating on social media, the Bennet heir swapping a socialite for a maid. "My car's in the back," Christopher replied quietly. "Let's go." As they walked down the side aisle of the cathedral, avoiding the main crowd, Lucy felt the reality of the situation begin to weigh on her. "Christopher, your company, your family." "Lucy," he stopped, turning to face her. "I've spent 3 years putting other people's expectations above my own happiness. I won't make that mistake again." When they reached the black Aston Martin parked at the back of the cathedral, they were surprised by James, Christopher's private chauffeur for 15 years. "Where to, sir?" "The apartment in Brooklyn," Christopher replied, opening the door for Lucy. "The one nobody knows about." As they drove through the city, Lucy watched Manhattan fall behind them through the car window. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken promises and possibilities. "I bought this apartment 2 years ago," Christopher explained as they crossed the Brooklyn Bridge. "It was my refuge when the family pressure became unbearable. Nobody knows about it except James." Lucy nodded, remembering the nights when Christopher would mysteriously disappear. "So that's where you went?" "Yes, and each time I wished I had the courage to invite you to come with me." The apartment was located in a historic building in Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the East River. When Christopher opened the Dr. Lucy was greeted by a space that seemed more welcoming than the Bennet mansion walls, with bookshelves full of books, comfortable furniture, and a spectacular view of Manhattan. "This place is much more you than that mansion," Lucy commented, noticing the worn editions of literary classics scattered around the coffee table. Christopher smiled, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. "Here I don't have to be Christopher Bennet the heir. I can just be myself." His cell phone started ringing. It was the 10th call from Margaret Bennet in the last 20 minutes. Christopher silenced the handset and placed it on the table. "We need to talk about what happened," Lucy said softly, sitting down on the sofa. "About what happens now." Now Christopher sat down next to her. "We face the consequences together. Bennet Industries will suffer a blow with the Sinclairs leaving, but I have alternative plans. I always have. Your mother will never accept this," Lucy gestured between them. "She'll do everything to break us up." "Probably," he agreed, taking her hands between his. "But I need you to understand something, Lucy. When you walked into that church today, you didn't just stop a wedding, you set me free." Suddenly all the ties that bound me seemed insignificant. Tears began to form in Lucy's eyes. "I'm afraid of not being enough, of not living up to your world." "My world." Christopher laughed softly. "Lucy, You are my world. Those parties, those superficial people, none of that matters. What matters is our conversations about literature at 3 in the morning, the way you know every little detail about me, how your smile brightens my darkest days." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and raindrops began to beat against the windows of the apartment. The storm that had been forecast for that day finally arrived, as if nature itself wanted to mark the beginning of this new phase in their lives. "We're going to face a storm over the next few days," Christopher continued, his intense gaze fixed on Lucy. "The press will hound us. My family will try to break us up. The shareholders will question my ability to lead. But, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing the right thing." Lucy leaned her forehead against his, allowing herself for the first time to believe that it was real. "Promise you won't regret it." "I'd only regret it if I'd said yes in that church," he replied, leaning in to seal their lips in a soft kiss, years of repressed feelings finally finding their expression. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside that Brooklyn apartment, two souls who had danced around each other for so long were finally finding their rhythm together. The road ahead would be difficult, but now they had something that no amount of money or social standing could buy. They had each other, and the certainty that some risks are worth taking in the name of true love. The morning after the scandal at St. Patrick's Cathedral dawned with the headlines of New York's leading tabloids, featuring photos of the moment Christopher Bennett abandoned his $1 million marriage for his maid. The New York Post spared no sensationalism. The Prince and the Maid forbidden romance shakes high society. Lucy watched the city from the window of her Brooklyn Heights apartment, an untouched cup of coffee in her hands. The night before had been surreal. After their kiss, she and Christopher had talked for hours, sharing all the little stories and moments they had kept to themselves over the past 3 years. "Don't read this," Christopher said gently, taking the tablet from her hands. He was already dressed for work, even though it was Sunday. The crisis in the company demanded his immediate presence. "Too late," Lucy sighed. "Apparently I'm a fortune hunter who meticulously planned her seduction for 3 years." Christopher pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead softly. "Funny how no one mentions that you have a master's degree in literature from NYU, which you got while working full-time." "How do you know that?" Lucy pulled away in surprise. "I've always known," he smiled. "I read your letter of recommendation when you applied for the job. I confess I was intrigued as to why someone so qualified would want to work as a maid." Lucy sat on the sofa, remembering that time. "My mother was ill in Milwaukee. The pay was good and I needed to send money for her treatment." "And now?" Christopher asked softly, sitting down next to her. "She's fine now, thank God. And to the health plan that you insisted on extending to all employees, even temporary ones." Christopher's phone vibrated again. It was his mother's 20th call that morning. This time he answered, putting it on speaker. "Christopher Alexander Bennett." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a razor. "The council is meeting in an hour. If you don't show up and fix this mess, I'm going to start the process to remove you from office." "I'll be there, Mom," he replied calmly. "But if you expect me to go back on my decision about Lucy, you're wasting your time." "That girl is manipulating you," Margaret exploded. Margaret exploded. "She planned the whole thing." "How could she have planned something that I also wanted?" Christopher retorted. "By the way, did you know that she has a master's degree, that she spent 3 years looking after our family while keeping her own mother ill? Lucy has more integrity in her little finger than Victoria Sinclair has in her entire body." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice dangerously controlled. "Bring her into the meeting." "What?" Lucy and Christopher asked simultaneously. "If she's as special as you say, let her face the council. Let her explain why she ruined a $1 million deal." Before Christopher could protest, Lucy touched his arm. "I will." "Lucy, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted him gently. "If we want this to work, I can't hide. I can't let them think I'm just a scared girl who ruined a marriage." An hour later, Lucy entered the Bennett Industries boardroom on the 50th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan. She was wearing a simple but elegant black dress that Christopher had insisted on buying on the way, arguing that Appearances shouldn't matter, but unfortunately they do. The 12 board members, including Margaret Bennett, watched Lucy like vultures ready to pounce on their prey. Maxwell Sinclair was also present, his face still red with anger. "Miss Anderson," Margaret began, her tone falsely sweet, "please, explain to the council why you saw fit to destroy a decades-long business alliance." Lucy took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had faced hostile audiences during her graduate school presentations. "Ms. Bennett, with all due respect, I didn't destroy anything. I prevented your son from making the mistake of marrying without love out of pure commercial interest. And I suppose your love for him has nothing to do with your financial position," Maxwell Sinclair scoffed. "No, sir," Lucy replied calmly. "It has to do with the fact that your son is an extraordinary man who deserves to be loved for who he is, not for what he has. Over the last 3 years, I've seen Christopher work tirelessly to modernize this company, implementing sustainability and employee welfare policies that have increased productivity by 40%. A surprised murmur ran through the room. Few knew about these as yet unreleased figures. "How do you know that?" one of the board members asked. "Because Christopher trusts me. On nights when he worked late in the library, we often discussed his ideas for the company. I suggested the scholarship program for employees' children, which he implemented last year." Margaret Bennett paled visibly. That program had been extremely well received by the media. "If you are concerned about the Sinclair contracts," Lucy continued, "I suggest you look into the Green Tech Solutions proposal. They have superior technology and more sustainable practices." Christopher, who until then had been watching with pride, intervened. "Green Tech approached us a month ago. Their conditions are better than Sinclair's." "That's absurd." Maxwell Sinclair stood up. "You can't." "We can and we will," Christopher interrupted him. "This meeting isn't about business, it's about trying to intimidate the woman I love." "Well, as you can see, she's not easily intimidated." The mood in the room changed subtly. Some advisors exchanged impressed glances, others furiously took notes. "If I may," Lucy concluded, "I'm not here to take anyone's place or interfere in business. I'm here because I love Christopher, and because I believe he deserves the chance to be happy both personally and professionally." Margaret Bennett stood up slowly, her eyes studying Lucy as if seeing her for the first time. The fate of Bennett Industries and of Lucy and Christopher's love hung by a thread, awaiting the matriarch's next move. The silence in the meeting room was thick as fog as Margaret Bennett studied Lucy with a calculating gaze. Finally, the Bennett matriarch made a subtle gesture with her hand, dismissing the council members. Maxwell Sinclair was the last to leave, slamming the door hard enough to make the windows rattle. "Sit down, Lucy," Margaret ordered, indicating a nearby chair. Christopher stepped forward protectively, but Lucy touched his arm gently. "It's all right," she murmured, taking the seat indicated. Christopher stood beside her, a comforting presence. Margaret poured herself a glass of water, her movements deliberately slow. "You mentioned the scholarship program. Was that really your idea?" "Yes, ma'am," Lucy replied. "My mother was a teacher before she became ill. Education was always a priority in our family, even when we didn't have much." "What about the partnership with Green Tech?" "I researched the company after hearing Christopher mention the negotiations. Their numbers are impressive, and their values align better with the modern vision Christopher has for Bennett Industries." Margaret took a sip of water, her eyes never leaving Lucy's face. "You know, you could have used that information for blackmail. You could have sold corporate secrets to our competitors." "Mom," Christopher protested, but Lucy held up her hand, silencing him. "Mrs. Bennett, in the last 3 years, I've witnessed more family and corporate meetings than I can count. I know about the skeletons in the closet, the secret alliances, the backroom deals. But I've also seen your son turn this company into something bigger than profits and power. I saw him create a corporate culture based on respect and innovation." Margaret leaned forward, interested. "Go on." "Bennett Industries can survive without the Sinclairs, but not without Christopher. He's the future of this company, and he deserves the chance to lead in his own way." A small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on Margaret's lips. "You know, Lucy, when I hired you, I thought you'd be just another temporary employee. But you've lasted longer than all the others. Did you know why?" Lucy shook her head, curious. Because you never tried to attract attention. You never flirted with Christopher. You never tried to take advantage of your position. On the contrary, you worked hard, studied, looked after your sick mother, and yet you still found the time to really get to know my son. Christopher looked as surprised as Lucy at his mother's words. The Sinclairs are corporate dinosaurs. Margaret continued, getting up to walk to the window. Victoria would have destroyed Christopher, just as Maxwell destroyed my marriage 30 years ago. What? Christopher asked, shocked. Margaret turned to face them for the first time, allowing her mask of perfection to slip. Why do you think your father traveled so much? Christopher Maxwell and I had an affair. When I broke things off, he threatened to ruin the company. Your father has never completely forgiven me. Lucy felt Christopher stagger slightly beside her, absorbing the revelation. Instinctively, she intertwined her fingers with his. Marrying? Victoria was my attempt to make amends, Margaret admitted. I thought that a formal alliance with the Sinclairs would finally bury that chapter, but I was just repeating the cycle of manipulation. Why are you telling us this now? Christopher asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Because, Margaret sighed. When I saw Lucy defending you today, I realized that she has something Victoria never had: integrity. And maybe it's time Bennett Industries was guided by something other than power and revenge. Lucy could hardly believe what she was hearing. Margaret Bennett, the woman who orchestrated marriages of convenience and manipulated high society like a chessboard, was effectively giving her blessing. That doesn't mean it will be easy, Margaret warned. The press will be merciless. The Sinclairs will try to destroy us. We need a plan. I already have one, Christopher said, squeezing Lucy's hand. We'll announce the partnership with Green Tech tomorrow. As for the press, let them talk. Our story is stronger than any gossip. And I, Lucy added, surprising herself with her confidence, can use my degree in literature to help in the communications department. I have some ideas for humanizing the company's image. Margaret nodded slowly. Very well. Christopher, prepare the announcement for tomorrow. Lucy, welcome to the Bennett family, officially this time. When they left the office an hour later, Lucy was still processing everything that had happened. In the elevator, Christopher pulled her into a soft kiss. You were amazing in there, he murmured against her lips. Your mother surprised me, Lucy admitted. I never imagined. Neither did I. Christopher laughed humorlessly. Apparently we all have our secrets. As they left the building, they were greeted by a small crowd of photographers. Christopher instinctively put himself between Lucy and the cameras, but she surprised him again by holding his hand tightly and smiling at the flashes. Are you sure? He asked softly. Absolutely, she replied. I'm not going to hide, remember, besides. She smiled. I think we've just gained a powerful ally. As they walked to the car, facing the reporters' flashbulbs and questions, with dignity, Lucy thought about how life could change in just 24 hours. From being a maid in secret love to being an official part of the Bennett family facing New York high society alongside the man she loved. The storm hadn't passed yet, but now they had an unexpected umbrella in the form of Margaret Bennett. And sometimes, Lucy reflected, the best love stories are those that surprise us not only with their romances, but with their redemptions. The news of the romance between Christopher Bennett and Lucy Anderson dominated the headlines for days. The New York Post's page 6 devoted entire pages to analyzing every aspect of the scandal of the year, from Lucy's modest apartment in Queens to her origins in Milwaukee. Gossip blogs speculated about the future of Bennett Industries, while Victoria Sinclair gave tearful interviews about her devastating betrayal. Lucy was watching all this from the rooftop of Christopher's office a week after their fateful, interrupted marriage. The partnership with Green Tech had been successfully announced, the company's shares remained stable, and Margaret Bennett, surprisingly, was proving to be a formidable ally. Penny for your thoughts, Christopher said, entering the room with 2 cups of coffee. It was still strange for Lucy to be served by him after so many years of doing the opposite. I was thinking about how things have changed, she replied, accepting the cup. A week ago I was tidying up your library, and now you're helping to revolutionize our communications strategy, he added, kissing her forehead. The board loved your proposal for a series of documentaries about the company's employees. Lucy smiled, remembering the presentation she had given the day before. Her idea was to humanize Bennett Industries through the stories of its employees, from the cleaning staff to the executives. "Mr. Bennett," Amanda's voice, his new assistant, sounded through the intercom. "Your mother is here with, well, Mrs. Anderson." Lucy almost knocked over her coffee. "My mother." The door opened to reveal Margaret Bennett in her usual Chanel ensemble, accompanied by a middle-aged woman with grey hair and eyes identical to Lucy's. "Mother." Lucy stood up, shocked. "What are you doing in New York?" Helen Anderson smiled, opening her arms to her daughter. "Your future mother-in-law thought it was about time we got to know each other properly." Christopher watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and amusement. Margaret Bennett, the woman who used to judge people by the size of their bank accounts, had personally picked Helen Anderson up from the airport. "I discovered that Helen and I have a lot in common," Margaret commented, taking an elegant seat in one of the armchairs. "We're both retired teachers with a particular taste for Victorian literature." Lucy cast an incredulous glance at Christopher, who seemed equally surprised by this new development. "Your mother told me about your plans for the company," Helen said, holding her daughter's hands. "I always knew that your master's degree in literature would end up being useful in unexpected ways." "Actually," Margaret interjected, "that's why we're here. Helen has come up with a brilliant idea to expand your documentary project." Lucy sat down next to her mother, curious. Helen Anderson had always had a gift for stories. It was one of the reasons Lucy had fallen in love with literature. "What if, in addition to the stories of current employees, we included stories from previous generations?" Helen suggested. "Retired employees, children who followed in their parents' footsteps in the company, a living archive of Bennett Industries history," Christopher added, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Exactly," Margaret agreed, "to show how the company is part of the history of New York, of the families who helped build it, including," she hesitated briefly, "including the less glorious parts of our own family history." Lucy realized the weight of those words. Margaret was willing to expose her own vulnerability, her history with Maxwell Sinclair, to show a more human side of the company. "We could start with pilot interviews next week," Lucy suggested, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Mom, could you help us with the narrative structure?" "I'd be honored," Helen smiled. "And maybe we can include some Milwaukee stories too, show how Bennett Industries impacts communities beyond New York." Christopher watched the interaction between the three women with a growing smile. It was surreal to see his mother, always so formal and distant, genuinely engaged in a conversation with Helen Anderson about storytelling techniques and social impact. "Oh, and Lucy," Margaret added casually, "I cancelled your contract as a housekeeper this morning. As of now, you are officially the new Director of Communications and Social Responsibility at Bennett Industries." Lucy choked on her coffee. "What, but I have no corporate experience." "You have 3 years of direct observation of the company, a relevant master's degree, and innovative ideas," Margaret replied firmly. "What's more, you've faced a hostile board of directors without blinking. I'd say that's experience enough." Helen shook her daughter's hand proudly. "See, I always said you were destined for great things." "What about the nasty comments?" Lucy asked, still hesitant. "People will say that I only got the job because of Christopher." "Let them talk," Christopher replied, coming up to kiss her forehead. "Your results will speak louder." "Besides," Margaret added with a sly smile, "I've already leaked your academic records and your thesis on transformative narratives in modern literature to the press. The Wall Street Journal is particularly interested in your analysis of how stories can impact the public perception of large corporations." Lucy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Within a week, her life had been completely transformed. From secretly in love housekeeper to publicly loved communications director, with her mother and future mother-in-law planning projects together. "Well," Helen said, standing up, "I think this deserves a celebration. How about a family lunch?" "Excellent idea," Margaret agreed. "I know a great Italian restaurant on the Upper East Side." As the two women left the room discussing restaurant options, Christopher pulled Lucy into his arms. "Happy?" he asked softly. "More than I thought possible," she replied, burying her face in his chest. But it still feels like a dream. It's not a dream, he assured her, kissing her gently. It's only the beginning of our story. Lucy's first official meeting as communications director at Bennett Industries took place one fall, morning 2 weeks after the fateful interrupted marriage. The office that once belonged to Victoria Sinclair, who held a merely decorative position, was now filled with storyboards and detailed timelines for the documentary project. The first testimonials are amazing, Lucy explained to the newly formed team of enthusiastic young professionals that Christopher had personally recruited. Janet Miller, who has worked in cleaning for 30 years, revealed that she paid for her 3 children's college with the company's scholarship program. All of them are now executives in different sectors. And don't forget Mr. Rodriguez, Helen Anderson added from the back of the room where she was helping with the narrative structure of the stories. He started as a messenger in 1975 and is now vice president of international operations. Lucy's transformation from maid to executive had not been without its challenges. Some senior employees still looked at her suspiciously, and whispers in the corridors were inevitable. But she was determined to prove her worth through results. Lucy, Amanda, her assistant, interrupted the meeting. Vogue is on the line. They want to do a story on you, from the library to the boardroom, a modern love story. Lucy sighed, exchanging a look with her mother. The interview requests kept coming in, each outlet wanting its version of the corporate fairy tale. So far she had turned them all down. Tell them we appreciate it, but right now we're focused on telling the stories of the real heroes of Bennett Industries, Lucy replied diplomatically. After the meeting, Lucy found Christopher waiting in her office with a mysterious smile. I have a surprise for you, he announced, handing her an envelope. Inside was a deed the apartment in Brooklyn Heights, the one that had served as a refuge for them after their broken marriage was now in both their names. Christopher, Lucy whispered, overcome with emotion. You didn't have to. It's our place, he explained, pulling her close, where we can just be ourselves without expectations or pressures. The moment was interrupted by Margaret Bennett, who entered without knocking, a habit she refused to give up. The Sinclairs have just announced a merger with our West Coast competitors, she informed them, her expression serious. Maxwell, Ty's clearly trying to put pressure on us. Lucy felt Christopher tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. We expected that. Green tech gives us a technological advantage over them. Yes, but we need a strong public response, Margaret insisted. Lucy, that idea about turning the company's history into a documentary, how long would it take to have something ready? With the current team, we could have a pilot episode in 2 weeks, Lucy replied, her mind already calculating logistics, focusing on the most impactful stories showing how Bennett Industries changed lives. Perfect, Margaret smiled. And I suggest we include our own story. Lucy and Christopher exchanged surprised glances. Our story. Yes, Margaret confirmed. Show the world that Bennett Industries is entering a new era, one where human value matters more than social status, where a brilliant woman can rise from the library to the boardroom on her own merits. But people can see that as self-promotion, Lucy argued. Or they can see it as inspiration, Helen intervened, entering the room. Sorry, I couldn't help overhearing. Lucy, your story represents hope for so many people. Christopher squeezed Lucy's hand gently. It's your decision. Love, no pressure. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment, thinking. When she opened them, there was determination in her gaze. We'll do it, she decided, but our way. No glamorization or over-dramatization. We'll show the reality, including the difficult moments, the doubts, the prejudices we face. And we'll include my story too, Margaret added softly. It's time to break the cycle of secrets and manipulation that has defined this family for so long. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lucy divided her time between directing the filming of the employees' testimonies and preparing her own narrative. Helen became a constant presence in the company, her experience in storytelling helping to shape the stories in a powerful and authentic way. The project began to take on a life of its own. Employees who were initially hesitant to take part were now queuing up to share their stories. Each testimony revealed a new facet of the company, that even the Bennett family didn't fully turn us. One evening, while going over the material in their Brooklyn apartment, Lucy found Christopher watching the city from the window. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, hugging him from behind. "About how you've transformed not just my life but the whole company," he replied, turning to face her. "You brought humanity to a world that had long forgotten what it meant." Lucy smiled, resting her head on his chest. "We did it together. You gave me the platform, You filled it with truth," he added, "and that my love is more valuable than any commercial contract." Outside, the lights of Manhattan shone against the night sky, a constant reminder of the corporate world they were working to transform. But there, at that moment, they were just Lucy and Christopher, two hearts that had found each other, despite all the odds against it. The launch of the Bennett Industries pilot documentary took place on a rainy October evening at an intimate event at Lincoln Center. Lucy watched nervously from the aisle as New York's business elite settled into the auditorium. Christopher held her hand, silently transmitting his strength. "Breathe," he whispered, kissing her temple. "You've achieved something extraordinary here." The documentary began with Janet Miller, the cleaning lady, telling how Bennett Industries had changed her life. The black and white images of her children graduating from university caused the first emotional gasps from the audience. Next came Mr. Rodriguez's story. His journey from internal male to vice president, illustrated with old photos and moving testimonies from colleagues. But it was when Lucy and Christopher's story began that the auditorium fell completely silent. The images of the Bennett Mansion library, captured with respectful intimacy, showed the environment where their love had blossomed. The narration by Helen Anderson had an emotional depth that only a mother could achieve. For 3 years, Helen's voice echoed through the auditorium. Two souls danced a silent waltz between shelves of books and cups of tea, a love story that transcended social barriers and reminded us that a person's true worth doesn't lie in their surname or bank account. Lucy felt tears well up in her eyes when the scene of the interrupted wedding appeared on the screen. The footage captured by the cathedral's security cameras showed their determined entrance and the moment when Christopher chose love over social conventions. But the real surprise came with Margaret Bennett's testimony. Sitting in her office, the Bennett matriarch removed her mask of perfection to tell her own story of forbidden love and the consequences of allowing social expectations to dictate decisions of the heart. "I spent decades building walls around myself," Margaret confessed on screen, "until a young woman with nothing but true love in her heart had the courage to tear them down. Lucy Anderson didn't just save my son from a loveless marriage, she saved our family from repeating the same mistakes of the past." When the lights came up, the silence was broken by deafening applause. Lucy saw tough executives discreetly wiping away tears, and journalists who used to be fierce critics of Bennett Industries furiously taking notes. Maxwell Sinclair, who had attended the event ostensibly to witness a failure, stood up abruptly and left the auditorium. His hasty exit was noticed by everyone, but no one cared. The story had touched hearts in a way that no corporate maneuver could overcome. "Lucy Anderson," a voice called out as she finally emerged from the aisle. It was Catherine Reynolds, CEO of the country's largest media network. "You've just redefined what it means to tell a company's story. I'd like to discuss a possible partnership to expand this project nationally." Before Lucy could respond, other proposals began to emerge. Executives who had previously treated her with disdain were now vying for her attention, each wanting to be the next to have their corporate stories humanized by Lucy's unique touch. "Excuse me," Christopher interjected softly, noticing the overwhelm in Lucy's eyes. "My fiancé needs a moment." Fiancé. The word still made Lucy's heart skip a beat. The proposal had happened the night before, intimately and perfectly in their apartment in Brooklyn. No pomp or circumstance, just true love and sincere promises. "Are you okay?" he asked when they finally found a moment of privacy in one of the dressing rooms. "Better than fine," Lucy smiled, adjusting the vintage engagement ring that had belonged to Christopher's grandmother. "Just a bit overwhelmed by it all. A few weeks ago, I was serving coffee at board meetings, and now..." And now you're revolutionizing the way companies tell their stories, Christopher added, pulling her into his arms. I always knew you were extraordinary, Lucy. The rest of the world is only just beginning to realize it. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. It was Helen Anderson, her eyes shining with pride. Lucy, darling, CNN wants a live interview for their morning show, and the New York Times is asking for an exclusive story on the documentary production process. Lucy took a deep breath, feeling Christopher's silent support. Tell them I'll do the interview, but on one condition. I want the focus to be on the employees' stories, not on our romance. Helen smiled, proud of her daughter's humility and integrity. I've already told them that. Do you know what the reporter said? That it's precisely your authenticity that makes the story even more powerful. As they left Lincoln Center that evening, in a fine rain that made the city lights dance on the wet asphalt, Lucy reflected on how life could change in unexpected ways. True love had not only transformed her own story, but was helping to transform the narrative of one of the largest corporations in the country. What are you thinking? Christopher asked as they got into the car. About how sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from the heart, she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder, and how I can't wait to see what other stories we'll tell together. The success of the Bennett Industries documentary reverberated throughout the corporate world over the following weeks. Lucy found herself navigating completely new territory, from media interviews to invitations to lecture at prestigious universities. The love story that began in the library of a mansion had turned into a phenomenon that transcended romance, touching on profound questions about corporate values and social transformation. Ms. Anderson called out a student during her lecture at Columbia Business School. How did you deal with the initial prejudice of the Bennett Industries executives? Lucy adjusted the microphone, exchanging a quick glance with Christopher, who was watching discreetly from the back of the auditorium. With hard work and authenticity, when you're sure of your values and purpose, other people's opinions lose their power over you. The answer generated enthusiastic applause, but was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Amanda, his assistant, with a worried expression. Lucy, we need to get back to the office immediately. There's been a leak. In the car on their way to Bennett Industries, Lucy and Christopher discovered the extent of the problem. Maxwell Sinclair had gained access to old emails between Lucy and her mother, in which she expressed doubts about working for the Bennetts during her first few months as an employee. They're twisting everything, Amanda explained, showing the headlines on her tablet. Planned insider questions the Wall Street Journal. The New York Post is even worse, the real plan behind the corporate fairy tale. That's ridiculous, Christopher growled, his hand squeezing Lucy's. Those emails are from 3 years ago when you'd barely started. Lucy remained silent, her mind working rapidly. The words in his old emails, taken out of context, painted a distorted picture of his intentions. We need to be proactive about this, she finally said. No hiding or denying. At the office, they found Margaret Bennett already organizing a crisis task force. The Sinclairs think they can destroy us with this, she declared, her voice carrying a fierce determination. But they've forgotten one crucial thing. What? Lucy asked, still processing the situation. That we now have the best storyteller in the country on our team? Margaret smiled a smile that resembled a predator about to pounce. And most importantly, we have the truth on our side. Over the next few hours, Lucy worked tirelessly with her team. Instead of issuing a standard statement denying the accusations, she decided to do something different. She organized a live broadcast on the company's social networks. Yes, those emails are real. Lucy began sitting in the library where it all began. When I came here, I was a scared young woman from Milwaukee, trying to earn enough money to help my sick mother. I had doubts, fears, prejudices, based on what I read about the ultra-rich in the newspapers. The camera caught every nuance of her sincere expression as she continued. But then I met the real Christopher Bennett, not the media caricature. I met employees like Janet Miller and Mr. Rodriguez, who showed me that this company was more than sensationalist headlines. Christopher joined her on the broadcast, his calm presence anchoring her. What the Sinclairs don't understand, he added, is that our story is about transformation. Not just our personal transformation, but the transformation of an entire corporate culture. The broadcast went viral instantly. of True Bennett became a trending topic, with thousands sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice and personal transformation. Helen Anderson, who had rushed to New York as soon as she heard about the leak, brought her own contribution to the narrative years of correspondence, documenting the genuine evolution of Lucy's feelings from her initial doubts to the deep love that blossomed naturally. "My daughter has always been an open book with me," Helen declared in an interview with Good Morning America. "If you read all the emails, you'll see a story of personal growth, not manipulation." As the dust began to settle, something unexpected happened. Bennett Industries' shares rose. The market apparently was more impressed by the company's transparency and authenticity in dealing with the crisis than concerned about the Sinclairs' accusations. "You know what's ironic," Lucy remarked to Christopher that evening as they watched Manhattan from their apartment in Brooklyn. "Maxwell Sinclair tried to destroy us by exposing my past doubts, but he only succeeded in making our message about authenticity and transformation even stronger." Christopher pulled her into his arms, gently kissing her hair. "Because you turned an attempted attack into an opportunity to genuinely connect with people. That's why I love you, Lucy Anderson. You see beauty where others see weakness." Lucy's phone vibrated. It was another lecture request, this time from MIT. "They want me to talk about authentic corporate communication in times of crisis," she laughed softly. "You should accept," Christopher smiled. "After, all who better to talk about turning adversity into opportunity." Lucy nodded, feeling stronger after weathering this latest storm. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but now she knew that each obstacle was just another page in their story of love and transformation. The news of Lucy and Christopher's engagement circulated around the city like a gentle whisper, a far cry from the explosive scandal that had marked the beginning of their story. The official announcement was made during a Bennett Industries charity dinner, where Lucy presented the first tangible results of her social responsibility program. "It is with immense pride that I announce not only the record numbers of our educational initiative," Christopher declared into the microphone, his voice charged with emotion, "but also my personal commitment to the woman who has transformed not only my life, but the essence of this company." The vintage ring sparkled under the lights of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the event was being held. Lucy noticed Victoria Sinclair watching from a far corner, her face a mask of forced composure. But this time, there was no bitterness. In Lucy's heart, only gratitude for the path that had brought her there. "Ms. Anderson," a familiar voice called out after the announcement. It was Robert Chen, CEO of one of Silicon Valley's largest technology companies. "Or should I say the future Mrs. Bennett? Lucy, please." She smiled, noticing the glint of genuine interest in the businessman's eyes. "Lucy, then. I've been following your transformation work at Bennett Industries. It's extraordinary how you've managed to humanize a corporation without compromising its operational efficiency." The conversation was interrupted by Margaret Bennett, who approached with calculated elegance. "Robert, I see you've already met my future daughter-in-law. Perhaps we could discuss that partnership proposal now." Lucy watched in fascination as Margaret masterfully steered the conversation. The Bennett matriarch had transformed in recent weeks, gradually abandoning her mask of coldness in favor of an authenticity that surprised everyone. "A merger between Bennett Tech and Chen Industries?" Lucy asked later when they were alone. "That would completely change the game against the Sinclairs." "Yes," Margaret smiled, a shrewd glint in her eyes. "And it was your influence that made it possible. Robert Chen always refused to work with us, saying that our corporate culture was too traditional. His work changed that perception." The success of the event was interrupted by unexpected news Maxwell Sinclair had suffered a heart attack. The information came through Victoria, who surprisingly sought Lucy out in her office the following morning. "He's stable," Victoria reported, looking genuinely vulnerable for the first time since Lucy had met her. "But the doctors say that the stress of the last few months has contributed significantly." Lucy felt a pang of guilt, even though she knew she wasn't directly responsible. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I really am." "You know what's ironic?" Victoria continued, sitting down, uninvited. "Dad always said that the Bennetts were our natural enemies. But now, seeing how you've transformed this company, maybe we were all wrong." The conversation that followed was surprisingly honest. Victoria revealed how her father's pressure to keep up appearances and business alliances had stifled her own dreams. "I never wanted to be a CEO," she confessed. "I always wanted to work in art restoration, but that wasn't appropriate for a Sinclair." "It's never too late to change," Lucy replied softly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. That evening over dinner in her Brooklyn apartment, Lucy shared her thoughts with Christopher. What if we expanded our corporate transformation program to include a partnership with MoMA? Victoria has expertise in art, and this could be a bridge to reconcile the families. Christopher watched her with admiration. "You never cease to amaze me. You know that even after everything the Sinclairs have tried to do to us, you still find a way to create something positive." "I learned from someone who chose love over pride," she smiled, leaning in to kiss him. The plan began to take shape over the next few days. Margaret, initially skeptical, was convinced after a long conversation with Helen Anderson about the power of redemption. Lucy's mother had become a kind of moral conscience for the Bennett matriarch, an influence no one could have predicted. "Sometimes the biggest deals are sealed, not with contracts but with forgiveness," Helen wisely observed during one of their now frequent conversations in the library of the Bennett mansion. The visit to the hospital where Maxwell Sinclair was recovering was a turning point. Lucy and Christopher were initially met with suspicion, but when they presented their proposal for a cultural partnership, something changed in the old businessman's eyes. "You could have used my condition to finalize the destruction of the Sinclairs," he said in a hoarse voice. "Instead, you're offering an honorable exit and a real opportunity for Victoria." "Because business doesn't have to be about destruction," Lucy replied gently. "They can be about transformation." As they left the hospital, Christopher intertwined his fingers with Lucy's. "Do you know what I love most about you? Your ability to see the best in people even when they can't see it in themselves." Autumn in New York painted Central Park in golden hues as Lucy finalized the last details of the Transformations exhibition at MoMA. The initiative, born out of her unlikely connection with Victoria Sinclair, had grown into an ambitious project that united art and social responsibility. "Each piece tells a story of change," Victoria explained to a group of journalists, her passion for restoration art finally finding a voice. The exhibition featured works restored by the team she led, along with stories of Bennett Industries employees who had undergone their own transformations. Lucy watched discreetly from the mezzanine, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. Just a few months ago, Victoria had been her nemesis in a broken marriage. Now they were working together on something bigger than their past differences. "Impressive, isn't it?" Margaret Bennett appeared at her side, elegant as ever in her Chanel. "How people can surprise us when we give them the chance to be who they really are." "You've changed too, Margaret," Lucy observed gently. "I never imagined I'd see you supporting a partnership with the Sinclairs. Your mother taught me that some traditions are worth breaking." Margaret smiled, a gesture that now looked natural on her previously controlled face. "Helen has a unique way of making people see beyond their own limitations." As if invoked by the mention of her name, Helen Anderson approached them carrying her inseparable notebook. The success of the Bennett Industries documentary had inspired Helen to start her own project, a book about corporate transformation through personal narratives. "Maxwell Sinclair has just arrived," Helen reported, her voice soft but firm. "First public appearance since his heart attack." Lucy felt her heart speed up slightly. Despite the initial reconciliation at the hospital, this would be the first time all the families had met publicly since the broken marriage. Christopher met her moments later, his green eyes shining with that look that still made her heart skip a beat. "Ready to make history again, my love?" "With you always," she smiled, accepting his outstretched hand. The moment they walked down to the main hall was captured by dozens of cameras. The press were hungry for another chapter in the Bennett Sinclair saga, but what they found surprised everyone. Maxwell Sinclair, leaning on a cane, hugging his daughter Victoria, with tears in his eyes as he watched her restoration work. "You were right all along, darling," his hoarse voice echoed through the silent hall. "Art is your true calling." Lucy felt Christopher squeeze her hand gently. That moment of Maxwell Sinclair's vulnerability broadcast live on several news channels was worth more than any press release or marketing strategy. The evening progressed like a carefully orchestrated dream. Helen Anderson and Margaret Bennett circulated around the room as an unlikely but effective duo, their different perspectives on life complementing each other perfectly. Robert Chen, who had flown in specially from San Francisco for the event, watched everything with genuine interest. "You've achieved the impossible," he commented to Lucy over cocktails. "You've transformed a toxic corporate rivalry into a model of innovative collaboration." "It's not all down to us," Lucy replied, watching Victoria passionately explain the process of restoring a particularly challenging canvas. "Sometimes people just need permission to be authentic." The highlight of the evening came when Maxwell Sinclair asked to speak. Leaning on his cane, he walked to the center of the room, his face marked not only by age, but by newfound humility. "For decades, I've built my empire on the idea that business is war," he began, his voice firm despite his physical frailty. "I turned rivals into enemies, differences into battles. But look where it got me, to a hospital room alone with my regrets." The silence in the hall was absolute. Lucy could feel the historic weight of that moment, the transformation of decades of animosity into something new and hopeful. "It took a brave young woman breaking off a marriage," Maxwell continued, his eyes meeting Lucy's, "to show me that there are other ways to build a legacy. Lucy Anderson, soon to be Lucy Bennett, not only saved my daughter from a loveless marriage, but she also saved our family from itself." Maxwell's words reverberated around the room, carrying the weight of a public confession that no one had expected. Lucy felt silent tears run down her face as Christopher hugged her from behind his chin, resting gently on her head. The Transformations exhibition would become a milestone in the history of the two families, not just as a successful art project, but as the symbol of a new era in corporate relations. An era where authenticity and collaboration replaced manipulation and rivalry. Later that evening, as they looked out over Manhattan from their refuge in Brooklyn, Lucy and Christopher reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. "Do you know what's most incredible?" Lucy murmured, nestled in her fiancé's arms. "How a decision made out of love can create such profound waves of transformation. And to think it all started in the library of a mansion," Christopher smiled, kissing her forehead softly. "With a brave maid who dared to believe that true love still existed in the corporate world." The success of the Transformations exhibition at MoMA marked the beginning of a new phase in Lucy and Christopher's wedding preparations. The date had been set for early spring, a choice that symbolized the rebirth and transformation their lives had experienced. "No cathedral this time," Lucy joked as she strolled through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden with Helen and Margaret. The place, with its cherry blossom trees and extensive gardens, perfectly represented the elegant simplicity they desired. "Are you sure you don't prefer St. Patrick's?" Margaret asked, a slightly wry smile on her lips. "After all, you already have experience making dramatic entrances there." Lucy laughed, still impressed with how her future mother-in-law had developed a sense of humor in recent weeks. Margaret Bennett's transformation from overbearing matriarch to a more vulnerable and authentic woman was perhaps the most surprising change of all. "The garden is perfect," Helen opined, making notes in her inseparable notebook. "Intimate, natural, unpretentious, exactly how your love began." Wedding planning became an unusual collaborative project. Victoria Sinclair, using her knowledge of art and design, offered to coordinate the decoration. "Consider it my way of giving something back," she told Lucy during a meeting, "for showing me that there are truer paths than arranged marriages." At Bennett Industries, changes were still taking place. The merger with Chen Industries was progressing rapidly, creating a new dynamic in the corporate market. Robert Chen had become a frequent visitor to New York, his innovative ideas from Silicon Valley perfectly complementing Lucy's transformative vision for the company. "You've created something revolutionary here," Robert commented during a video conference. "The idea of humanizing corporations through personal stories is exactly what the business world needs right now." Christopher watched with pride as Lucy conducted the meetings with a unique blend of empathy and assertiveness. She had found her own leadership style, one that didn't try to imitate the traditionally masculine patterns of the corporate world. "I remember the first time I saw you leading a meeting," he remarked one evening, while they were having dinner in his Brooklyn apartment. "You were serving coffee to the board, but you already had that twinkle in your eye, as if you knew that one day you'd be leading the discussion." Lucy smiled, remembering those days. "I never imagined I'd get here. I was so focused on helping my mother on surviving." "And now you're transforming lives," he added, holding his hand over the table. "Not just mine, but everyone around you." Preparations for the wedding were progressing in parallel with the professional changes. Lucy insisted that Janet Miller, the cleaning lady, who had become a symbol of change in the company, be her godmother, along with Helen. Maxwell Sinclair, recovering from his heart attack, surprised everyone by offering his house in the Hamptons for the post-ceremony party. "It's a more discreet property," he explained during a family dinner that now included both the Bennetts and the Sinclairs, away from the paparazzi and the hustle and bustle of the city. The press, of course, remained fascinated by the story. The New York Times had devoted an entire Sunday special to the phenomenon they called the Bennett Quiet Revolution, highlighting how a love story had catalyzed significant changes in the corporate world. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is real," Lucy confessed to her mother during an afternoon of wedding dress fittings. They had chosen a simple but elegant model by New York designer Jenny Packham, very different from the extravagant Vera Wang dress that Victoria never got to wear. "It's real because it's real," Helen replied delicately, adjusting her veil. "Every moment, every decision, every transformation, it all came from the heart." As the wedding date approached, Lucy found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there, from a scared young girl in Milwaukee to a respected executive in New York, from housekeeper to fiancée of the man she loved. Every step had been a lesson in courage and authenticity. "Do you know what impresses me the most?" Margaret commented during one of the family dinners that had now become a tradition. "How? You've never lost your essence throughout all these changes. You're still the same Lucy, who took care to serve tea at the right temperature during our insomnia." Lucy smiled, remembering the evenings in the library of the Bennett mansion where it all began. Some things don't have to change to be extraordinary. The week leading up to the wedding at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden turned Lucy and Christopher's Brooklyn apartment into a headquarters of final preparations. Flower samples, guest lists, and detailed timelines occupied every available surface, creating an organized chaos that reflected the fusion of their lives. "The cherry trees are blooming earlier this year," Victoria commented, adjusting the last details of the decorations on her tablet. "It's as if even nature is conspiring to make this wedding perfect." Lucy smiled, watching the city from the window as she clutched her morning cup of tea. Victoria's transformation from rival to friend and collaborator still surprised her sometimes. "Who knew we'd be here a year later?" "Certainly not me," Victoria laughed softly. "I was so blinded by the idea of being the perfect bride that I completely forgot to ask myself if it was what I really wanted." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Helen Anderson, carrying an old box that Lucy recognized immediately. "Mom, you brought—" "The Milwaukee album," Helen added, her eyes sparkling. "I thought it would be appropriate to share some memories before the big day." The three women gathered on the sofa as Helen opened the album, photos of a young Lucy at her NYU graduation, working part-time in coffee shops, always with a book nearby. "You've always been determined," Helen commented, her voice soft with pride. "Even in the most difficult times, you never lost your essence." Victoria looked at the photos with genuine interest. "It's amazing how you've built your path without giving up who you are. I think that's what impressed me the most, and irritated me at first," she admitted with a self-conscious smile. The sound of the elevator announced the arrival of Margaret Bennett, who entered carrying a Tiffany's box. "I found this in the family vaults," she announced, revealing a delicate pearl necklace. "It was my grandmother's. She was also a woman who defied the conventions of her time." Lucy touched the pearls, gently moved by the gesture. "Margaret, I don't know what to say." "Say that you will continue to transform our family and our company with the same courage you showed in that church," Margaret replied, her voice firm but caring. and that you will make my son as happy as he has been since you came into our lives." The moment was interrupted by a phone call from Christopher. The merger with Chen Industries was finally complete, marking the beginning of a new era for Bennett Industries. "Robert Chen wants to make a public announcement during the wedding reception," he explained, his voice excited. "He says he can't think of a more appropriate moment to celebrate the union of tradition and innovation." Preparations continued throughout the day. Janet Miller showed up in her bridesmaid's dress, a choice that had caused a stir in Manhattan's more traditional social circles. "My children can hardly believe it," she commented, her eyes watering. "They say our story is inspiring other companies to review their hierarchical structures." In the evening during the wedding rehearsal, Lucy observed the extraordinary gathering of people that her love for Christopher had brought together. Maxwell Sinclair was chatting animatedly with Robert Chen about possible future collaborations. Helen and Margaret were planning a joint mentoring program between their former schools. Victoria was discussing art with MoMA curators who had become regulars at Bennett Industries. "Happy?" Christopher asked softly, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her. "More than I ever thought possible," Lucy replied, leaning back against him. "Sometimes I wonder if all this is real." "It's more real than anything we've ever experienced," he assured her, kissing her neck softly, "because it's based on truth, not expectations or obligations." After the guests left, Lucy and Christopher remained in the garden of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden under the cherry trees that would bear witness to their union in a few days. The night air carried a promise of spring, of new beginnings. "Remember the first time I saw you in the library?" Christopher asked softly. "You were organizing the poetry books, humming softly, and you pretended to be looking for a financial report," Lucy added, laughing. "But I saw you hiding a volume of Keats under the papers. At that moment something changed," he confessed, as if the world had found its right axis. Lucy entwined her fingers with his, feeling the comfortable weight of the engagement ring. "And to think we almost let fear get in the way of all this." "But you were brave for both of us," Christopher smiled. "And now look what we've built together." The gentle wind swayed the petals of the cherry trees, creating a delicate dance of pink and white against the Brooklyn night sky. In 2 days, they would exchange vows under these very trees, surrounded by people who had been transformed by the power of true and courageous love. Lucy thought of all the mornings in the library of the Bennett mansion, the cups of tea shared in silence, the stolen glances and guarded dreams. Every moment had been a brick in the construction of this new reality, where love and authenticity could coexist with success and tradition. The dawn of the wedding day brought with it a gentle breeze that made the cherry trees of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden dance gently. Lucy Anderson watched the sunrise from her old bedroom in the Bennett mansion, where she had spent her last night as a single woman, following tradition. "Ready?" Helen asked, entering the room with a cup of the chamomile tea her daughter loved so much. It was the same kind of tea that Lucy used to serve Christopher during their long evening chats in the library. "It's strange," Lucy replied, accepting the cup. "This room where I started as a maid is now where I'm preparing to become a Bennett." Margaret Bennett entered next, already impeccably dressed in her pale blue Chanel ensemble. In her hands, she carried an antique velvet box. "I found this morning," she said, revealing a delicate sapphire brooch. "Christopher always admired it when his grandmother wore it. I thought it would be his perfect something blue." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparations. Victoria arrived with the team of hairdressers and makeup artists, transforming the room into a makeshift studio. Janet Miller brought coffee and fresh croissants from Lucy's favorite French bakery in Brooklyn. "The gardens are absolutely magical," Victoria reported as she adjusted Lucy's veil. "The cherry trees seem to have been waiting for this moment to reach their peak of bloom." The Jenny Packham dress, with its elegant simplicity, perfectly reflected Lucy's essence. No excess or ostentation, just pure authentic beauty, just like the love she and Christopher shared. "Miss Lucy," a familiar voice called from the door. It was James the chauffeur, who had witnessed so many crucial moments in her history with Christopher. "Mr. Maxwell Sinclair is here. He'd like to talk to you before the ceremony." Lucy found Maxwell in the office, where he was waiting, leaning on his cane. His face, previously always marked by hardness, now bore a new serenity. "You look radiant," he commented, his eyes misty. "You know, I spent decades believing that marriages were just business transactions. You and Christopher have proved me wrong." "It's never too late to change your beliefs," Lucy replied softly. "That's why I've come to make an announcement in person," Maxwell continued. "I'm transferring part of the shares in Sinclair Enterprises to a fund dedicated to scholarships for young talent. I'm calling it the Lucy Anderson Fund, a reminder that sometimes the greatest talents come from the most unexpected places." The news left Lucy speechless. The transformation of the man who had previously tried to destroy her was perhaps the greatest testament to the power of love and authenticity. When the time finally came for the ceremony, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden was transformed into a modern fairy tale setting. Cherry blossom petals floated in the air like pink snow, creating a natural canopy over the assembled guests. Christopher waited at the makeshift altar, his Tom Ford tuxedo contrasting perfectly with the natural setting. His eyes met Lucy's as she began her walk down the flower aisle, and the world seemed to stop. Helen Anderson and Janet Miller, the bridesmaids, preceded Lucy in their navy blue dresses. Margaret Bennett, sitting in the front row, held Maxwell Sinclair's hand, both visibly moved. Victoria, next to Robert Chen, smiled with genuine happiness. The vows were exchanged under a gentle shower of cherry blossom petals. Christopher spoke about late libraries and cups of tea, about courage and transformation. Lucy spoke about true love and the strength of being authentic, even when the world expects you to be someone else. During the reception held in the gardens of the Sinclair mansion in the Hamptons, Robert Chen made the official announcement of the merger between Bennett Industries and Chen Technologies. "This is a new chapter not only for our companies," he declared, "but for the entire corporate world, a chapter where humanity and success are not mutually exclusive." Lucy and Christopher danced their first waltz under the stars, surrounded by the people their courageous choices had transformed. Soft music echoed through the gardens as they moved in perfect sync. "Happy," Christopher whispered in her ear. "More than words can express," Lucy replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Who knew that a cup of tea in the library could lead to all this? The evening progressed with stories being shared, laughter echoing, and new bonds being forged. Helen Anderson and Margaret Bennett were already planning their next joint initiative, a mentoring program for young entrepreneurs focused on authentic leadership. When the last dance ended and the guests began to leave, Lucy and Christopher remained in the garden watching the stars. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. "Do you know what I love most about you?" Christopher asked, pulling her into his arms. "How you've transformed not only my life, but touched and changed so many other lives in the process." Lucy smiled, thinking of all the stories that had intertwined with theirs, Janet Miller, and her college-aged children, Victoria. Finding her true passion in art, Maxwell Sinclair rediscovering his humanity. "True love does that," she replied softly. "It transforms us into the best version of ourselves, and in the process inspires others to do the same." The lights of the Hamptons shone in the distance, and the evening breeze carried the scent of flowers from the garden. Lucy Anderson Bennett, the girl from Milwaukee who had dared to believe in modern fairy tales, was finally home, not just in the arms of the man she loved, but at the center of a story of transformation that would continue to inspire others for a long time to come.